Light as a feather, stiff as a board. Light as a feather, stiff as a board. This is a No Fear podcast. We know what scares you.
I'm Matt.
I'm Mel.
And I'm Lisa.
And this is the No Fear Cast, the podcast where we dissect horror and all the things that scare us. This is the 8th episode of Season 3, and we are finishing our series devoted to witches.
I'm trying not to sound snarky when I say this, but Mel, have you never played Light as a Feather, Stiff as a Board?
I have never played that particular game. I'm sorry. I tried to follow your stage directions and everything. So.
Light as a feather, stiff as a board. Light as a feather, stiff as a board. Light as a feather, stiff as a board. Okay. So now I'm questioning everything I did in my childhood. Matt, did you ever play Light as a Feather, Stiff as a Board?
No. Not ever.
Oh, really? Okay.
I'm aware of it as a thing, and I know that it's something that people do, but I, at least in my childhood, it was always that was a thing that girls do at girls' slumber parties. We were too busy playing Super Nintendo and hitting each other on the back of the head.
I guess as boys do.
Yeah, pretty much. Farting, burping.
It's
Wow.
Is this what I have to look forward to in my future when my sons are old enough to have friends over for slumber parties?
Without a doubt.
Wow. Okay. No, so I remember playing Light as a Feather, Stiff as a Board, and we would usually ease into it at slumber parties. We would usually tell some ghost stories. There always was or kind of more urban legend type things. This was before the internet was available in everybody's home, so we had to tell each other stories. So there was a lot of local urban legends that we told, and then it would always evolve into daring each other to play Bloody Mary. The whole go into the bathroom with a candle and turn off the lights and say Bloody Mary. But we would usually play Light as a Feather, Stiff as a Board. And that's the game for listeners who are uninitiated, where one girl would lie down on the floor, on her back, and the other girls would circle around her and put two fingers under, kind of on the edge of her body, and then we chant Light as a Feather, Stiff as a Board together, kind of in unison. And the idea was we were supposed to get her levitating off the ground. I don't remember us ever levitating anybody, but we scared ourselves silly with those stories. And of course, that is a famous scene in The Craft, because they do get the girl to levitate, and it's one of the reasons that I love that movie so much. I think because I have that connection to it. But it makes me think about some of the things that we've talked about over the course of the series, talking about witches. And that's, we've made the connection about how women, or girls really, are often drawn to witchcraft, or they're presented as witches. And certainly there's a historical precedent for that. Even in talking about the history of Halloween, which I think we've talked about a few seasons ago, and how girls would try to use these divination schemes, to learn who their husband was and that sort of thing. But we've always had this kind of connection to magic. And looking at the history of witches, at least over this series, I've noticed that whenever women are given power through the witchcraft, it seems like popular culture wants to take that away a little bit. First they're presented as the kind of evil hag, the shriveled up woman that nobody wants and who is unmarried and childless and living on the edge of society. And then she morphed into the beautiful housewife of like the 50s and 60s. But she always wanted to denounce her power or somehow downplay it or use it to like clean her house, something acceptable for a woman. But then we get this really interesting thing happening in like the 90s. And we get the teenage witch. And The Craft is only one example. But the more I started thinking about it, there's a lot of kind of teenage or young adult, maybe I'm using the word teenage loosely there, but young adult witches. They're no longer the old hags, but they're also not the housewives either. And I'm curious, I don't know, what do you guys think about that? Because that is a very odd turn of events.
Yeah, I mean, I honestly, I don't know the reason behind it, or I can't think of a reason behind it, but I mean, you're right that there is this focus, especially in the 90s and into the 2000s, on teenage witches. And yes, we can say Sabrina the Teenage Witch was based on a comic book that started, in the 50s or 60s maybe, but there was the Sabrina show starring, what's her name? Melissa Joan Hart, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then,
right.
And then there was
Clarissa Explains It All.
Yes. I was about to call her Clarissa, and I was like, nope, that's not her real name. But
it is her real name.
But yeah, as you've pointed out, there's The Craft and Charmed was doing really well in the late 90s and into the 2000s. Buffy the Vampire Slayer featured lots of witches and witchcraft. But I honestly, I mean, I don't know what it was about the 90s personally that had such a focus on it.
There also seems to be a connection with comedy at first too, right? Because Sabrina the Teenage Witch, at least, I mean, the original one was more like a sitcom than anything else. And Buffy the Vampire Slayer, while serious, had its moments of comedy as well. I mean, I don't precisely, I'm not trying to say something profound with that, but I just thought it was interesting that's kind of, I don't know. I mean, the character, like Sabrina the Teenage Witch, she has power, right? But it's in this kind of bewitched type frame that maybe doesn't take it completely seriously, with the little jokes about witches in it and the fact that, I don't know, it's almost like Saved by the Bell with witchcraft or something.
That is a really good descriptor, because I feel like, and I don't even know if I watched the show in its entirety, because when I was looking it up, I didn't realize it went on for so long. But it came out in 1996 and went to 2003. And I think there was also a movie. Maybe the movie predated.
I think that was the pilot, I think.
The pilot was a movie, yeah.
Was it like a backdoor pilot kind of thing where they did a movie and then spun it into a series? I
think so. And it had the guy, if I'm remembering right, I'm having to reach way back into my memory for this. So I may be remembering it wrong, but I'm almost positive it had the guy who is the main actor in Entourage. But like the teenage version of himself.
You mean when he was younger?
Yes, the teenage version of himself. Adrienne Grenier. I'm pretty sure but he was not on the TV show. But I think he was her love interest, because I seem to remember, like, the goal of the movie was to go to a prom style dance. And then the TV show, Mel, like you described it so well, was definitely Saved by the Bell, because I feel like it even reached into her college years, very awkwardly. So, but yeah, it was played for laughs, and the magic was just almost there to disrupt her life in a funny way. Like, oh, I'm going to use my magic and it's going to go wrong, and I'm going to turn my math teacher into a frog by accident. Oops. I don't know if that was an actual plot line, but it seems like it could have been. Like, it was very, it was very easy to watch and light and fluffy and fun. But I found this really interesting because I always thought The Craft, which also came out in 1996, was a much like grittier version of witchcraft. And, of course the girls, they all wear black and, they seem so much edgier than Sabrina, the Teenage Witch, who looked like she walked off of like a bubblegum commercial. But I was surprised to see that they came out the same year.
Well, and how edgy was The Craft besides like the dressing? I mean,
they wore black.
They
I'm pretty sure they've painted their nails black. I'm just saying. For 16-year-old me, that was the height of edge.
Well, and
I mean, the fingernails black, that puts it over the edge right there.
Well, I think for Hollywood producers and whatnot, that was clearly the symbolism, that they were edgy, that they were dressed in black and painting their nails black. But I'm just trying to think back on The Craft and try to remember, because it's been a while since I've seen it, and I have not gone back and rewatched it during this series. Almost pointed because
Matt,
I don't want to ruin my memories of it as being an okay movie. Not great, but okay.
I rewatched it recently, and it actually holds up all until the really bizarre last scenes. I think like the final battle between, and I don't remember the girls' names now. I think let's see, Sarah was the new girl, and then Nancy was the kind of leader, and they have like a battle it out scene, which gets kind of weird, kind of creepy. That's when all the bugs and roaches and snakes come out of the walls and things like that. But it was a weird, and I think the ending is very problematic too, where and we're gonna spoil this because it came out in '96, where Nancy ends up tied to a bed in a mental institution, which seems like I don't think that could happen today. Like I don't know if they put that scene in a movie. But yeah, looking at it, I was looking over some of the quotations because I was in researching this. I was debating whether or not to use for our intro that light as a feather, stiff as a board, or the one where she says, "We're the weirdos, mister," which I think is like the other iconic line that I remember. But when I was looking over it, Matt, kind of like you were saying, it's like you realize it really wasn't quite as edgy as you wanted to remember. Because there's conversations like this one, between Sarah and the mean girl Laura Lizzie, who I remember that feeling very epic when I watched it. Like I was like, yeah, she's the mean girl and she's blonde and she's gonna get her, she's the bully who's gonna get what's coming to her. And when they're like pulling her hair and she says, oh, I thought I saw a bug. They have shampoo for that, And I was like, well, okay, that wasn't as much of a jab as I thought it was. And the spells that they do, they're the typical like love spells, right? Like make him love me, which I never really understood because the guy in the movie was not that great. I mean, he proves himself to be an asshole pretty early, and then they do a beauty spell, and I mean, I know it's supposed to be profound because the one girl has scars on her back. Which, by the way, they never really explain. But still, there's that whole scene where they're basically having a slumber party and they're changing each other's like hair color and eye color, and hey, they're teenage girls and they can have, this is what they want to do with their power, which apparently is really strong and real. I don't know, like it does come across as a little bit of. I don't want to say it's like Saved by the Bell, but it's a little bit, I don't know, maybe we could say this one is Clueless with magic. Really, when you start kind of taking it apart, like it doesn't hold up as well as I wanted it to. But I still love it.
Well, I mean, it seems to me like, well, thinking back, like Matt, that they're all just kind of like types of teenagers. Yeah, like they each there's a bully and there's the mean girls and then there's the idea, what is it, the love spells and the beauty spells and all. It's almost like somebody is thinking about like the stereotype of what teenage girls would be like, maybe. And the types of teenage girls, and it's like, let's just give them powers. And then, so, I mean, if you didn't have the magical powers, it would just be a movie about teenagers with the same themes and the same things happening, only now they have supernatural powers and they're using those to be a teenager. At the same time, I don't necessarily want to like condemn them and say it's like a stereotype, because I don't know. I mean, if I was a teenager and I all of a sudden had magical powers, would I want would I do the same things with them that I would now? I don't know. I don't know. Maybe I would be just as superficial.
Yeah, and I mean they do turn their magic. I guess their search for, once they get over that initial, we're looking for these superficial things. We're looking for love, we're looking for beauty. They go after money at one point, and then they start to seek the real, like, big power. They start in, what do they call it, invoking the spirit. Mm-hmm. And eventually when they perceive Sarah as being disloyal, they basically gang up on her to get her, or to murder her and make it look like a suicide, basically, through magic. And so it does go beyond just those kind of superficial things. But this is what's also kind of problematic, is after they move beyond the superficial things and they start experimenting with their real powers, by the end, really none of them have the powers. As I mentioned before, the ringleader ends up in a mental institution. Her two followers or whatever don't have power. They say they don't have powers anymore, and so there's just Sarah left, and it's kind of left open-ended. We assume she still has her powers, but we also assume that she's learned the lesson of, oh, I'm not going to try to go for real power. And so it's, even though she's not like the housewife who swears off marriage, as happened in some of the films we discussed, I don't know. It's still kind of the, oh, well, I do have natural powers, but I'm not going to use them because that would be irresponsible of me. So they're all kind of left powerless in the end, which is a bit of a bummer.
Yeah, they kind of just find out that power corrupts and turns them against each other. And so if the teenage girls, they either use it for superficial reasons or they can't control it and they use it for horrific reasons, so you might as well just stop. I mean, I guess in some ways,
yeah, exactly.
It's like, yeah, in some ways, you're right. I hadn't really thought about that, but yeah, it's like the women in the past are like, well, I have to get married and now I'm going to give up my magic. And here it's like, well, we'll let these girls keep their magic, but to become mature, you have to realize that it's too dangerous to have anyway.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And why couldn't the lesson have been, like, it would have been kind of a cool movie had, they realized that power, that does corrupt them and does corrupt their relationships, but then they learn to harness it. Mm-hmm. Or some, I don't know, maybe that would have been too cheery for the 90s, but, to realize that they were kind of stronger together when they didn't turn on each other. Because that wasn't a bad plot point to make them go after, because that is a natural progression, I think. Like, once you realize you can do this kind of superficial stuff, it's kind of like, oh, well, hey, what else can we do? And to kind of see how far you can push it. But then just to be like, oh, well, I'm not mature enough to handle that much power. So, that kind of bugs me.
Well, I mean, maybe it's showing, I mean, you're totally right about the progression, but maybe it's, I don't know. I mean, well, I would say maybe the point of the movie is that female community is dangerous. If they work together, it could be dangerous in some way. Maybe it would be cheery from our perspective, because what I'm saying, but maybe that would be too much power.
Yeah, I guess, you know, yeah, and I feel like in a lot of these, we kind of, if you dig into them, you see a lot of the same narrative, and there were a lot of good things about the craft. And in doing my reading, and I will go ahead and say I'm a fan of all things witchy, but I am not an expert in witchcraft by any means, so I will probably say something incorrect. But in doing some research into this, I saw a lot of like practicing Wiccans who credited the craft for its attention to detail and kind of showing, if not witchcraft in a positive light, at least in kind of an honest light, because a lot of the spells and incantations and stuff that the girls do were based in real things, and I thought that was interesting. But you're right, like it's so and it kind of bugs me that witchcraft is one of those things that does, and I know, and I'll go ahead and say this just as a disclaimer, there are so many good witch movies that we have jumped right over because we just don't have time to cover it all, and we will swing back to witchcraft at some points because I want to get you guys to watch some of my favorite movies, which we haven't even talked about. But one of the things in looking at this is that I've noticed that witchcraft seems to be, and again, we're not including like Harry Potter because of, what those are wizards, I guess. But that witches seems to be a power that is granted to women. And these narratives are constantly trying to control that. And I think the 90s obsession with teenage witches was another way of doing that, because how often do we take teenage girls and like dismiss them? Right? Like the quickest way to say, like it's shorthand, for instance, the quickest way to say like music is bad is to be like, oh, well, that's a band that teenage girls listen to. And then suddenly that's, oh, okay, I know what that is. Or, oh, that novel, well, yeah, I mean, teenage girls like it. And it becomes like this easy way to dismiss something. And I feel like that's kind of what we're doing here is especially in the craft, because you have these girls who do have this enormous power. And it's just kind of like, yeah, but they're teenage girls. Like they don't need it. Or they're going to do something dumb with it. So
yeah,
it's frustrating.
It is. And we use that dismissive language for women as well. Certain books or movies are chicklet or chick fit flicks, that people just aren't,
right.
Oh, you don't want to see that. As if there's like one audience that's going to enjoy that particular thing. So yeah, you're right. There is that kind of gendered or dismissive language that happens.
Yeah, it's frustrating. I do want to talk a little bit, because I know we mentioned Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And Matt, I'm hoping you know a little bit more about this than I do, because it's been a while since I've watched some of these episodes. But one of the really interesting things I think that Buffy the Vampire Slayer did, and I think it kind of I think it looks forward to some of the things that we see now with witches, is the idea that, you had the character of Buffy, right? And the whole idea of Buffy is that she was born to be the Slayer. It was something that was like fated to her. But witchcraft, at least as presented in like Buffy the Vampire Slayer and in a lot of these, because it was presented that way in the craft. I mean, Sabrina was born into it. The whole idea was that she got her powers, I guess, on her 16th birthday, and it came down through her father. And the craft, one of them, the main girl, Sarah, was a natural witch, I guess, and she had gotten her powers from her mother. It was kind of implied. But the rest of the girls didn't have that lineage. And in Buffy the Vampire Slayer, you didn't have the same thing where it was like this role of there was the one slayer and she was, it was foretold that she would come, but that witchcraft was kind of available to any of the women. And so you had really neat storylines, particularly of Willow kind of finding her way into that community. And it was something to be sought out and not something that was just given to you because you were born a certain way.
Well, that's definitely true for the way it's excuse me, the way it's portrayed in Buffy, and I guess the greater Buffy verse, if you will. Yeah, I've always seen Willow as an interesting kind of counterpoint to Buffy for the exact reason that you said. Like Buffy's born into this and has no choice, whereas Willow actually not only seeks it out and becomes really adept at magic through like study and practice, but it's something that she chooses to do. I mean, there's a lot of Buffy's struggle with, I don't want to be the Slayer. I was born into this thing and I never had a choice. Whereas Willow is like, no, this is empowering for me, like literally empowering. And to the point where, I mean, again, we're going to do some spoilers for shows that have been long off the air, that, I mean, she actually did kind of become the big bad in one of the seasons where, like, she's essentially dealing with grief and her magic goes all crazy and out of control. But aside from that, I mean, I would say, yeah, for Willow, it takes her from just a bookish, nerdy sidekick who's able to help Buffy and just be there as like a support for Buffy, to an actual like developed character of her own, if that makes sense.
No, that makes complete sense. And I hadn't forgotten. I really vividly remember kind of when she does go off the rails and becomes kind of the big bad. And that was so touching for me watching that. And it's very different. Now, I hadn't even made the comparison before, but since we're talking about the craft, in that you see, and I guess it's the difference between a movie and a TV show, because the TV show had space to explore it. But you don't see girls just kind of misusing their power and kind of going over to the dark side, and then suddenly being stripped of their power. But it was really integral to the character building of Willow, because there was a real reason for why her magic went dark. I don't know really how to describe it other than that. But how she went to that dark place and that bad place, and to see her struggle through that and to understand that it's part of her. And I thought that was I thought a really honest way of looking at it, because, and again, I don't know much about witchcraft in the real world, but I would think it would be something that, it's not that you join the good side or the bad side. It's that if you have power, that power can be used for good or it can be used for evil. And you have to, I don't know if learn to control it is the right word, but you just have to accept that that's part of it, and that's part of you too, which I don't know, I liked that storyline in Buffy.
Yeah, and I would even say with the idea of witchcraft, at least as I understand it, as practiced by pagans and Wiccans and whatnot in the real world, that one of the things that they strive for is kind of that idea of balance between those sort of dualities. This is, like you said, this isn't Star Wars where you either are good or are bad. You're either the light side or the dark side. I mean, I think we as humans innately, we do good things, we do bad things, and it's kind of a daily struggle to try to be a better person and not be a worse person. But I would say with few exceptions are there people that are wholly good and wholly evil, and I think I think Willow and her magic, like you said, it fits into that idea pretty nicely there. And I think she went dark because her love died, right? Because Tara died. I'm remembering that right. Okay.
Right.
Just for those of you that haven't seen Buffy.
Yeah.
She was...
I mean, now that you put that in my head, that sounds right.
It's been a little bit since I've watched Buffy, but I want to say in that season, because she was in a relationship with another girl named Tara, and I believe she was killed, like, accidentally or something by these guys that, like, they set them up, these three guys up to be the big bad of the season, and then it turns out, oh nope, spoiler, it actually was Willow, because Tara dies and Willow goes, like, off the rails crazy, as I think many of us would. But in her case, she has all of this power that is no longer under her control, because she's kind of a tempest of her own, like, emotionally speaking.
You know, you said something interesting that I want to go back to. And that's the idea of how we get to see not Buffy, Willow, really kind of grow as a character, because she does go from being the sidekick to being one of the main characters, you know, with her own storylines and her own power, to being a big bad, which was a pretty impressive move, I think, for the writers at least, to turn a beloved character into that. But one thing that I find, and this may be where I think witchcraft fits the teenage girl so well, and this is why I think I don't like even though I watched the original Sabrina the Teenage Witch, and I watched a little bit of Charmed when it came out. I think that came out towards the end of the 90s, like 1998, around there. And I haven't watched any of the new Charmed, so I can't say much on that. But you know, Charmed was the same way, where it was a bunch of three sisters who I guess inherited powers from their family, and they were living in this house in San Francisco, and they kind of became occult detectives in a weird way. Anyway, but unlike The Craft or Willow and Buffy the Vampire Slayer, they were given their powers. It wasn't something they sought out. And I think it allows, at least for characters and stories, like it did with Willow, this seeking of power. It's almost a search for identity, which I think a lot of teenagers just in general can identify with. This idea of, who am I in the world? You know, who am I apart from who my parents told me I was? And who am I, you know, outside of my friends at school? You know, outside of just my everyday life, who am I really? And that was, at least I think with Willow, was the character arc. I mean, you know, the girls in The Craft, we don't see much of them before, you know, because they're already dabbling in magic by the time the movie starts. But I imagine it would be the same thing with them, as it's a way of not just gaining power where they felt powerless, but this search for identity, and in a way kind of the freedom in that, of not being defined by other people, but seeking out how to define yourself. And I think that this theme works best when that's the storyline. And I think that's why Willow stands out in Buffy the Vampire Slayer, for that reason.
Well, I would argue even with Buffy that's kind of the main theme of the entire show, period, is this evolution from teenager into full-fledged adult. And you see that journey happen with Willow, you see it happen with Buffy, but pretty much all the characters that are the main characters, at least. Giles kind of stays stagnant because, I mean, he's already like middle-aged, but you know, I mean, while you were talking, though, I mean, I couldn't help but think that, I mean, maybe that's part of this appeal of having witchcraft as teenagers, is that it's not just this part of this search for identity that I think we all go through when we're teenagers and into our 20s and sometimes into our 30s. I think I mean, I wonder if the magic and the power could almost also be read as a metaphor for just puberty itself. I mean, the changes that we undergo that start that process mentally are also rooted physically, and you're a teeming bath of hormones, and
I mean, maybe you were. I was not.
No, of course not. Of course not. Never. Nobody else was.
I was perfectly put together.
But I mean, I wonder if that could be, I mean, I don't want to paint with too broad strokes here, because I don't think that all of these sort of teenage shows are using magic in that way. But I mean, I could definitely see it with The Craft. I could kind of see it with Willow in Buffy. I'm not familiar enough with Charmed to even really offer a stance on that, but I think they're slightly older anyway, aren't they? Or are they teenagers?
They're in the young adult category.
Yeah.
And honestly, I'll just go ahead and say, like, I watched a few of the episodes of the original, and it was not for me. So I can't really say much about it other than I didn't like it.
Oh. Well then, listeners, feel free to, chime in and correct us, those of you that have watched Charmed, because I haven't either. I think I've maybe seen an episode of it, but I couldn't even be sure of that, to be honest. But I mean, I do wonder though if like magic is kind of in some ways being used as this like metaphor for puberty and adolescence in general, because I mean, I don't know, just kind of what kind of fits.
Well, it kind of does, because oh, go ahead, Mel.
I was just going to say, while you guys were talking, I was thinking to myself that these are initiation stories. And, often you're literally initiated into witchcraft, right? Because you talk about rites and things like that, and spells and transformation. And I think it's very much like a metaphorical way of dealing with our transformation, quote unquote, at a certain age, and all the kinds of fears that go along with being initiated into something new, and all the kinds of new knowledge and change that comes with that. I was thinking about other fantasy adventure stories for kids and young adults while you guys were talking, and they all seem to take changes that would just happen in normal maturation, I guess, and put them in some fantasy world, and I'm wondering if witchcraft was just another way to deal with that.
I have two thoughts when you were saying that, Mel, because that's a really good point. I mean, it is in a lot of ways kind of an initiation into a new life, and with Willow, you definitely see that. Because I don't think it was a coincidence that she falls in love with a woman and kind of is awakened to her identity as a lesbian at the same time she's discovering witchcraft. But at the same time, I don't think that's all it is, because if I'm remembering right, but all these flashes are starting to come back. Didn't Oz come back around the same time? Like her old werewolf boyfriend from high school?
I couldn't answer that with any certainty. It's been too long. I know that she... Yeah, I know that he was there in season 4. That was when she was dating him, and then they break up, and Seth Green left the show or whatever. I don't know if he comes back then.
I just feel like, and I may be getting this wrong. Now I want to go back and rewatch her whole like story arc at this time, because I feel like his return was a lot about her realizing that she needed, in a way, was putting the past behind her, right? because I just remember her at some point wondering if she was in love with him again. But I may be misremembering that. It may have just been because I liked his character a lot. But I seem to remember there being kind of that questioning of, do I still love him? Like, is he still a part of my life, or do I just love him because of who he was in my past, type of thing. Anyway, if it wasn't written that way, it should have been. Because that would fit with this whole idea of not just being initiated into a new life, but kind of having to leave the old one behind, and discovering that who you are today was not who you were yesterday, and being okay with that. Which actually, and I'm not going to say much about this because this is a new show, but I am a few episodes into the chilling adventures of Sabrina on Netflix, which is, I guess, a remake of the TV show, taking into account more of the comic book elements. But I have to say, so far from what I've seen, I love what they're doing with it, because it's less of Saved by the Bell with magic and more of all of these themes that we've been discussing. This idea of a search for identity and a search for freedom, and a trying to understand who you are as you're growing into adulthood. And there's some great, I don't want to say too much, but initiations play a part in more ways than one. I don't know. I really want everybody to go watch that show so we can talk about it, because I feel like at least they've learned their lessons. Because it's much more in the camp of the craft and Willow's story arc and Buffy the Vampire Slayer than it is with the original, or the original TV show, at least, Sabrina the Teenage Witch. Have you guys seen it at all, or am I the only one?
I haven't. I know that it exists, and I know that there was a lawsuit that we discussed in our mini episode.
Twice.
We did discuss the, yeah.
Yeah,
we should go ahead and say that. We've had some fun with our Patreon episodes. So, if that at all interests you, head over to our Patreon page, because we've been having some fun talking about witches in the news, and there's been some discussion about Sabrina there. But yeah, I would highly recommend going and watching that show, because I think it does correct a lot of the problems that were in this kind of teenage witch of the 90s, which was, I'm going to use my power so long as it will help me get a date to the prom. And it makes the stakes, I think, feel more real. So and I'm not finished with it, so I can't say much, but once I do finish it, I would love to discuss it with some of y'all. So speaking of, because if we're talking about witches in their most current iteration, I do, and I know Mel, you haven't seen The Witch yet. Matt, have you seen The Witch?
I have not seen it either.
Okay. I won't say too much, except, and I'm talking about the Robert Eggers 2015 film. One of the things I love about it is that it is everything we've been talking about: this search for identity, this search for freedom, a search for power when you have no power. One of the things I think it does really well, and this is something we haven't really talked about, and I think it's just because we haven't had time to talk about it, so hopefully we'll return to it, is the reason girls seek out witchcraft, or maybe that's the wrong way of saying it, the reason so many witches in films and literature are presented as female, and what society may do to push them into that role. In other words, what is society doing to make them powerless? To make that seem like a role that would be apt for a female, if that makes sense. That would be appropriate for a female versus a male. Because we kind of started off this whole 3-episode arc asking, why witches tend to be female. And I think that movie explores that a little bit. But it also leaves things, pretty vague. Because there's a lot of the puritanical belief in superstition and the idea of, whether or not it's actually real or not. That's played with too. But I don't know. It's pretty interesting because just to think about what has to happen first before somebody goes and needs to seek power or needs to be in a powerful position. If I'm making sense at all. But that may also kind of circle back to us talking about the phenomenon of the teenage witch or the adolescent witch. The idea that we tend to take away power from teenage girls. We don't expect much from them. So it's not surprising that we tend to cast them in supernatural powerful roles because we don't do that in real life.
Well, that may be probably a great place for us to end. And do either of y'all have any final thoughts on witches?
I will say, because this is one I did not talk about, but I'm curious. I heard today, or read today, that American Horror Story said that they're going to return to their witches again. So this would be like the 3rd series that the witches appear in, which I think is kind of fascinating. Given that American Horror Story has covered just about everything related to horror, and that the witches seem to be a perennial favorite. I don't know. I don't have any more thoughts on that. I just thought it was interesting to throw out.
Mel, any closing thoughts from you? Or?
No, I don't. I mean, I think we've covered it pretty well, and I think that's really interesting that American Horror Story is going back to the witch theme. It's like I hadn't even witches are not really my thing, and so when we decided to do this theme, I was trying to think of movies and books that we could talk about, and the more I started thinking about it and looking at it and talking to you guys, it's like there are witches everywhere, and it seems like we are in this. With Eggers film The Witch and The Chilling Adventures of Sabrina, and now American Horror Story going back to witches and Charmed coming back. We're definitely in a moment of witches. And if you check out our Patreon episodes,
you might say we're in a witch hunt.
We some people might say that. I was just going to shout out the Patreon one more time, that in our last 2 Patreon episodes, we talk about witches in the news, and they are all over the place, hexing people right and left. So this witch language is definitely in our culture right now. I won't say any more than that.
Well, all right then. Since you mentioned the Patreon, if you are interested or even just curious, it's patreon.com/nofearcast. For $5 a month, you unlock 2 extra episodes a month that are posted in our off weeks. They're usually a little bit shorter, but we always try to keep them related to the theme of what's going on in the main episodes. But they're a lot of fun, and I personally really enjoy just even doing them, to be honest. Not that I don't enjoy this myself, but the mini episodes are sometimes a little lighter even. But that's patreon.com/nofearcast. And as I'm sure every other podcast you've ever listened to said, please, if you like what we're doing, rate us, review us on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, wherever it is you're listening to this. Or heck, just tell a friend. We're our fan base seems to be growing a little bit. Our monthly downloads have been slowly going up, and that's all thanks to you listeners and the support that we've been getting from you guys. So if nothing else, thanks for listening, and yeah, we'll see you next time.